My name is Sofia. I'm here with my colleague Deni. How's it going, Deni?
It's going well. How are you, Sophia?
I'm good. We're here with Morning Consult Economic Intelligence and back with another episode. Unfortunately, this is going to be the last one for now. We're moving to more of a webinar type format and client-based format, but that's just for now. You'll never know. Maybe we'll bring it back in the future. But in the meantime, please subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't, because that will be continuing on. And we put basically a lot of what we talk about here into written form, and so it's super helpful. But today we wanted to do one last episode to talk about what's going on in the economy because a lot has been happening. But one main theme that we're seeing, not just in our data here at Morning Consult, but across a wide range of different kinds of government and business data, is this idea of hard data versus soft data. So that's going to be the big discussion tip today. And what we're aiming to answer is how are these tariffs and this economic uncertainty showing up in the data, and what kinds of data are they showing up in? So, as we get into that, Deni, could you please give us a definition of hard data and soft data and what the differences are?
Absolutely. So we like to delineate data into two different types, as you mentioned, hard data and soft data. And it's very important to look at both types right now. As I call this, this is very much of a shifting environment. And everybody's looking for clues. And what we see right now is two different stories coming out from the soft data versus hard data, as you've mentioned. So what is hard data? Let's start with that. Hard data are they're objective, measurable data that are widely recognized. Those types of data that typically go into calculating the, for example, the GDP growth. So some other examples would be the unemployment rate, consumer spending, the inflation data, the producer price indices. They have long time series. They are highly objective. They also measure an output. Um, um, the downsides of these types of data are that they're generally a bit more lagged and they look at the general population as a whole. And the soft data is some of the examples could be the consumer sentiment data, inflation expectations data, business expectations, even some of that commentary that you would read at the Fed's Beige book. The characteristics of this data is the opposite of the soft data. It's harder to identify, harder to measure, focus more on feelings and views rather than measuring certain outputs. So the minuses is that that's harder to measure. The pluses of this data is that they're usually more up to date. So a lot of the sentiment data, including our own, is very high frequency, very up to date. But we do get, for example, the GDP, which will be released this morning, is going to be a little bit lagged. Both provide a lot of good inputs to economists deciding, forecasting whether there'll be a recession or a certain percentage of increase or decrease in the GDP growth. Both do play a role, but I think a lot of the forecasting, I would say, heavily relies on the hard data.
So, basically, the soft data is more about feelings, vibes, the mood, the economic climate, which is quicker, easier to get a gauge on. And the hard data can be a little bit lagged because we're measuring actual outcomes, which can be very complicated statistically, computationally, lots of data to collect. Super useful, but it's good to have both of them, especially because during times like this, there's a a theory that soft data kind of leads the hard data in a lot of cases. That's why there was so much debate in you know, a year or two back around the vibecession because the soft data was more negative than people would have thought compared to the hard data. So we'll actually get into that at the end here. Is this another vibe session? But kind of what we're seeing is that the soft data is a little bit more sour than the hard data as of now. So with that being said, would you give us a temperature check on hard data versus soft data? So where are the temperatures for hard data and soft data with respect to the economy?
So as a reminder, our benchmark is 70 degrees. 70 is the perfect temperature. And I'm going to put them both below 70. For soft data, I'm going to put it at 58. This is really going to rely on a lot of the sentiment indices that are coming out, not from Morning Consult, but also business expectations and sort of focusing on the business side of things. So looking at both consumer and businesses, this data is coming in pretty weak right now. So that makes me think we are even below 60 at this point. Hard data, I would take this down a couple of notches too to 63, but obviously better than the soft data. And that's mainly because I just don't think we are seeing quite yet the possible effects of all this uncertainty in the hard data yet. Although there are some places that, it's showing up, certain changes, we'll get into that, the import figures, manufacturing data, shipping data, that does show some, potential pull forward and then future slowing of that hard data component. So for that, I think because of the few clues that we got there already, we notched it down to 63. Again, both below that beautiful 70-degree temperature.
Mm-hmm. And for those who have been following, we've been kind of measuring a lot of different hard economic data around 65 for a while now because things are already sort of softening a bit before all of this new economic policy and uncertainty really climaxed recently. So it was already sort of cooling down. We've seen it cool down a little bit farther, as you mentioned, we'll talk about more where the hard data has actually started to show some cracks forming, but right now it hasn't really manifested itself in the big um, government data. Although you did mention GDP is coming out this morning when this podcast is released. Um, it is expected to be softer than the previous quarter, but not negative. So we'll see what happens when it comes out. But that's one place where it could be starting to actually show up in the hard data, but we have a little bit more that we'll talk about later. So let's start actually with the soft data because we have our index of consumer sentiment here at Morning Consult. It's a great time to have this data on a daily frequency because not only are things changing so rapidly, um, we can see that changing rapidly, but I think it's more important than ever to see how different demographic groups are responding, how adults in general are feeling about all of these different changes, and to get a gauge on just the mood about the economy because it's very uncertain to all kinds of people, businesses, etc. So, at the all adults level, if you've been following, we've talked about these different timelines where ICS has moved. As a reminder, after the election, it shot up. There was a lot of optimism, especially about the future, and that came from all adults at the all adults level. Democrats were less optimistic after the election, which is completely expected and normal when we see elections with our data and with even the University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment. But that has changed since the administration has come into power, which is also not surprising. This tends to happen. Actually, honeymoon periods are a common term used for presidents or new administrations, and this one was particularly short. We saw Democrats and independents, and at the all adults level, basically right after inauguration start to go down even farther. I mention independents because they usually follow that all adults line more, whereas Democrats and Republicans follow the partisanship line. So they're a little bit better of an indicator of where, the average person falls when it comes to these things. And so they went up after the election and they went down after inauguration. And this downward trend has sort of now made its way across all partisanship lines. Even after Liberation Day, April 2nd, when all of those tariffs were announced, we saw Republicans even start to basically become a little bit more soured on the economy. But what we're seeing there is overall for all adults, not getting into political party, but most of it after the election and after inauguration has been concentrated in the future indexes. So, as a reminder, our index of consumer sentiment is built up of 5 sub-indexes, 3 of which are about the future, business conditions, personal finances, etc. And those have been hit particularly hard in recent months because people feel that the economy, may go into a recession, or things may not be so business friendly at the end of the year, or tariffs might hit their personal finances. What we haven't seen as affected is actually the portion of ICS which measures your current personal finances. So that index has actually been kind of running below the other 4 indexes since we had the most recent spike in inflation, but it grew through the end of last year. It's kind of stayed steady-ish through beginning of this year, 2025. Although I have noticed a slight downturn in recent weeks, and it's very subtle. Unlike those future indexes, which have kind of been declining rather sharply. That's basically what we have for the index of consumer sentiment, but that's just one of many measures of soft data. What else have we been seeing in other soft data, Deni?
Sure. So that sort of looks at the consumer side of things. And if we flip over and look at the business aspect, at Morning Consult, we focus a lot on the consumer and we survey consumers every day. But we have to supplement that information with the views from the business, especially now when this possible downturn is really going to start with businesses making decisions that will ultimately affect the consumer. With that in mind, what we're looking at is a lot of with regards to soft data, is a lot of the business expectation, business outlook surveys from the different federal boards. And, you can look at Dallas, you can look at Philadelphia, Atlanta, New York, you can look at sort of manufacturing, goods versus services. It's very broad based that the business outlook has deteriorated in the last 2 months across the board. So it remains to be seen while this, if this deteriorating outlook will translate to more tangible results, such as, wider layoffs, etc. We had one data release that was released yesterday, the JOLT survey and from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And when we look at that survey, and we refer to that survey a lot when we've been describing this frozen labor market, we have seen that conditions have stayed the same. We do not see these mass firings, but we also don't see any sort of advancement in job openings. In fact, they have ticked down again. We definitely continue to see that labor market in that frozen state. But what's good news so far is that we do not see this pessimism quite yet get translated to sort of layoffs in the actual data. Again, JOLTS is a bit delayed. The latest data is looking at March, and we are right now at the end of April. So it's, again, remains to be seen with the effects of tariffs if we're going to see more of the layoffs. But I think it's really going to start from there with this downturn of businesses making certain decisions, perhaps in reaction to the environment that we're in, that's going to result in consumers translating this sentiment, this pessimistic sentiment, into their actions with regards to their own spending and investment.
I find the surveys you mentioned from the regional Federal Reserve banks to be super interesting. And the reason why they're not considered hard data is because, for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar, a lot of the times the surveys are, there are numbers baked into it, but a lot of what's really interesting is the anonymous responses they get from business leaders from different sectors. And they like pull these quotes, and you can see a trend. People have made indexes based on these, but you can see words being brought up over and over again. And something that has come up across many of these different business surveys is people talking about tariffs over and over again. Almost everyone mentions the tariffs. Almost everyone mentions uncertainty or a difficulty with investing or creating new contracts, things like that. And so the tone there has really changed, and you can just see it just looking at the quotes that they pull out anonymously from these businesses. And the anonymous form of it also makes it really interesting and valuable because no one's afraid to say anything. But as you mentioned, we haven't seen that really play into the job market yet, and many different kinds of hard data. I think that's actually a great way for us to segue into the hard data state part of this. So, as we've alluded to many times, and as you mentioned with jobs, we haven't really seen this manifest itself in a lot of the hard data about how the economy is actually doing. And this is something that we've seen a lot actually in the past few years is, a lot of people are unhappy about certain things about the economy, but it keeps doing pretty well by a lot of measures. One of those is consumer spending, and that in Q1 continued to be really strong, but I think there's layers to it. And we have done a lot of research on this as we try to understand how consumers are approaching tariffs and what might be coming for the rest of 2025. So in Morning Consult spending data, it's slightly different than the government data because what we do is we poll consumers, not businesses, and we get an average spending level for the average consumer, but also different demographics. What we're seeing with our data is that Q1 spending was pretty good. It was pretty strong, especially from our high earners, which is something that we have been seeing over and over again for at least the past year and a half, as they continue to chug along and prop up a lot of the spending, and that's been seen in government data as well, so it's not just us. But part of it could actually be because of the tariffs, which is a little counterintuitive, but it makes sense when we think about how people respond to incentives. So in one of our more recent tariff surveys that we ran right after April 2nd, we asked people about how their spending behavior has changed due to tariffs. Across all goods and services, consumers said that they actually have spent more ahead of incoming tariffs. But what I found particularly interesting was the number of consumers who said that they pulled ahead purchases for large durable goods, because durable goods, they're not purchases that you make every day. And so pulling ahead those purchases can really give you a sense of what might be coming in the future. So, for example, one of the more popular choices was among those who said they bought a new car in the past 6 months, 42% of respondents said that they bought it sooner because of impending tariffs. And that was the most popular one in addition to exercise equipment. I think it makes sense that it was one of the most popular ones. It was also one of the most popular options for consumers to think that there will be a price impact from tariffs. And my theory on why that is because there has been separate tariffs for autos, and so there's more in the news for it. And I think people are more aware of how our supply chains are really interconnected with Mexico and Canada, who have been in the news about this a lot. But what's interesting is people don't really buy new cars. And if they do, they're probably not going to buy one again the same year. So if people are buying new cars now, that's kind of to me a sign that spending in the future will probably be muted because it's been pulled ahead. And I think we see that with a lot of our spending data. Is there anything you want to add to that before we move on to other hard data?
Yeah. I would say that there's definitely has been that push, from retailers as well to just mention to folks, yes, these tariffs are coming, and before these tariffs, do make this purchase. And I guess I would go back to the high income earners. They really did flex their muscle in this regard. When you mention these durable goods, they are higher in price. And so it's really those high income earners who have the ability to pull that purchase forward. They did flex that muscle and pull that purchase forward. Doesn't mean that the lower income people did not think about this. They also did pull some of the purchases forward. It's just not going to be as high price tag as your cars and your other durable goods, refrigerators, exercise equipment, etc. There's definitely, I think, a recency bias in the sense that people do remember the shortages in these categories after the pandemic. And perhaps they didn't make a purchase then, and they really need to make a purchase now because the life cycle of this machinery is coming to an end. And if they are able to, it does seem like they definitely put in some effort into making that purchase ahead of tariffs.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also our all at all income levels, consumers are expecting there to be cost pass through from tariffs, but it was higher for higher income consumers. So that could also be part of what's going on. Is they're more aware that the costs are going to pass through, and they're more able to actually have that cash on hand now to decide to pull up a major purchase, whereas someone who is lower income might not be able to even consider that. It's kind of a luxury to decide to buy a car earlier than you were intending. You have to have that money available. So that's part of it. Um, I think another thing related to this is, we mentioned cost pass through and what consumers are expecting. And this is another way we can kind of bring in morning consult data to understand future trends, not just current trends, but another hard data that we haven't seen anything really manifest itself from the tariffs is inflation. That's because there just simply hasn't been enough time where these tariffs have been implemented, especially the last round of these larger ones. And it is important to note that, I've seen a lot of people saying that, and especially because the market kind of corrected itself from its large downturns once there was a 90-day pause. But it's important to note that the 90-day pause isn't really as huge of a relief that I think a lot of people think it is. There's still really large, broad based tariffs on all countries, including Mexico and Canada. They have 25% on all non USMCA related goods and services. Imports to the US, but then there's that 10% broad based tariff. There's that 145% China tariff, which maybe or maybe not is going to come down. There's been talks of maybe it coming down, but that's still a lot of tariffs. But it hasn't been that much time, and I think we can actually point to the car example because we've talked to people who work in the car industry to better understand this. But I think this is the case not just for cars but for other retailers. But they have right now a lot of their stock. So the tariffs are more lagging when it comes to prices. So it's going to lag in real time on how it affects prices, and then it'll lag even more because government data is more backwards looking. So it'll be a while before we see that actually manifest itself in the inflation data. And what we're seeing in the inflation data now is really good numbers, actually. So, for example, CPI was quite low. It actually went back to where it was last summer when we were feeling really good about inflation before it crept up again. But it's back down, and it's really close to that 2% level from the Fed. So we have yet to see that come through, and we're going to need to wait several weeks, I think, before we see it in real time prices, and then more weeks after that before we see it in government data. But how I'm going to bring this back to morning consult data is our price sensitivity data. So, yeah, our price sensitivity data, as a reminder, it measures the share of consumers who walk away when they experience a higher than expected price. And it also ties back into what we were talking about with income. So it's particularly high for our lower income consumers, but it's at record highs for all of our consumers. They're just more price sensitive today than they were a few years ago. They're just like more burnt out from these high prices. Now that we've gotten through inflation, there's less savings, there's less firepower to get through another round of high prices. So that's something that could feed into the hard data once we see it actually manifest itself through prices.
And even I think in this goes back to the whole pull forward effect of the high income consumer, as they've expected these, prices to increase. A lot of them forward purchases. They may be surprised, but they will be probably also tempted to walk away saying, well, I have done a similar purchase maybe a few months ago, and this isn't, worth this money. Um, so definitely you can see that effect in the high income cohort as well. And it is sort of going to play out in the general macroeconomic environment too. I'll sort of tie this to jobs. We have seen the, deteriorating, sort of steady deterioration, but not alarming adjustment in the jobs and labor market statistics in general. I think one thing that might tip over even the high income consumer is if they do, as I mentioned, sort of if they do see unemployment figures ticking up, if we do transition further downwards from this frozen labor market to simply a bad labor market at this point where that unemployment index goes up right now, again going back to the hard data, our unemployment rate by the BLS release will be released on Friday. The expectations that for 4.2%, this is still very low by historical standards. Our morning consult intelligence daily data, unemployment index also quite low. It's sort of back down from its recent highs that we've had. I would say a seasonal pickup that we see in January, sort of certainly back down from that one. So the labor situation, despite the anxiety that we see from the businesses, is still good. But I do think that if that dynamic changes, the anxiety that the consumers feel right now about the future of the economy that gets reflected through the ICS, Index of Consumer Sentiment, could then translate to being sort of, funneled through the real dollar amounts that they spend or the houses that they may walk away from or other large purchases or discretionary purchases that they generally make, over the summer or really I'm thinking more into the fall and, holiday spending and travel. Those plans might actually get sort of cut off.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I wanted to ask you, so you kind of mentioned you you brought this up a few times, and I think it's a great point how we'll start to see the pain more when things affect the labor market because that's really what ultimately decides how people will decide to spend is if they have a job, especially on discretionary things. And we've seen anecdotal stuff about manufacturing companies pulling back their plans to create new projects here or new factories and maybe reduce staff, but that hasn't come through in the data like the JOLTS data we got. We didn't really see anything in the layoffs portion of that. But we have started to see little droplings of hard data. So, do you want to walk us through some of the smaller data points that show some early signs of softening in real hard data?
Yeah, so I think what gives us a bit more of this closer look and curiosity is when we look at the import data coming in. The imports once again spiked in March, especially the goods portion. And this is again businesses full in pulling forward all of the inventory that they want to have in place before the tariffs take effect. But then if you look at the more high frequency data, then it's going to be sort of the logistics and the shipping data. You will note that, after this Liberation Day tariffs, there's been a very sharp drop into when you look at the sailings from China, the US. So essentially, we have seen this build up especially after the Chinese New Year. A lot of that sailings took place, and then we do see a very big drop off after Liberation Day. What this translates to is those goods are not making their way into the United States in time. And that may cause some supply chain worries. It would affect the supply of those certain goods that are probably meeting the seasonal demand. May it be, your Thanksgiving decorations, your Halloween decorations, even perhaps earlier some, I'm guessing the back of school is in here, back to school dynamics, they have all that inventory is probably in the US right now. But even some laggards of that back to school. But all of those goods, they're at this point perhaps delayed, perhaps canceled, and that might result in some sort of a price shock, supply shock, which would then translate to price shock as well, coupled with additional tariffs on them if those tariffs are still in place when those sailings do at the end take place. So again, I'm talking about very much the future right now. I'm really looking into Q3 and Q4 because those sailings do take time. It takes time for that inventory to come to the United States and get processed. And other part of it is, the trucking volume out of Los Angeles. That's also down. So we have seen a very immediate reaction in that frequent data to on the import side of things, but what we haven't really seen is consumers noticing it because that is inventory for a couple of months down the road for the consumer. So that's why we've been focusing a lot more on the business's end of things, just because we want to read the tea leaves at this point as to what consumers may see in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's basically right now what we've seen is on the business side, and it has not yet reached consumers. That's basically how I would sum up this entire conversation. And I'm really curious to see our supply chain indexes on the consumer side. Once those start to flash red, we can then start to become a little bit more worried about how that will affect prices. Will it be similar to the supply shock we saw after COVID, during COVID, when supply chains really got blocked up, and that caused prices to raise. So we could see that again, but it's really important for all of us to note here that there's so much uncertainty, and a lot of this could be rolled back because, unlike the pandemic, this is caused by policy that can change and on any day. And so there could be it could just be that there's some minor disruptions and some of the policy is rolled back. That's definitely a possibility and something to not ignore as well, even though, we're prepared for this worst case scenario. If it continues, we will see some sort of pass through. So it's important to keep in mind that there's a variety of different forks in the road right now, and we still don't really know which one we're on going forward. So, I know we have been chatting for quite some time, but I did want to touch on, is this another vibe session? Do you want to weigh in? Do you think this is another vibe session where the soft data and hard data aren't matching, or do you think it's different this time?
Sense talking about soft data, I sense that this actually might be different, um, mainly from the sense that it is more cohesive right now. We do see this softening both from the business and the consumer side, the financial aspect. I mean,
Yeah,
it
it's
was a
not
very
just
broad
consumers this
based. Exactly. It was a very
time.
broad-based reaction. So I think that is perhaps one reason why I think it may not be a vibe session. But I do think that, it's very important what you said to keep in mind that we really don't know how this is going to unfold. We may have some tax policy changes that might affect consumers' decision making with regards to spending. All of these tariff decisions may be rolled back. There's been so many changes, hard to keep track of it as well. That certainly does affect business decisions, but it may not stay like this. So that being said, I think the general shock of it all, I do think that it wasn't really feeling like a vibe session. But I do say that it may also take a different route than what many folks think right now is, when it comes to, their recession forecasts. How about you? What do you think?
I agree with you. I think something I haven't heard anyone really mention is a lot of the vibe session debate was based on the level of consumer sentiment. So the level has sustained below what it was on average before the pandemic. And a lot of the questions are that were asked about this is why hasn't it returned to that level, considering a lot of economic indicators had returned to where they were before 2019. Um, but I think directionality it's different this time. So when we were last talking about the vibe session, which we keep talking about this. I don't think we've defined it, but basically it was that the the sentiment wasn't aligning with the economic data as it had in the past. And so some people thought we just had a recession in terms of sentiment and feelings and not in terms of hard data. But what's different this time is the index of consumer sentiment is going down. It's trending down. We keep seeing it week by week trending down. Whereas when we were in this vibe session, it was trending up. It started going up after inflation started cooling. And it was slow, and it never really got back to that pre 2019 or pre 2020, so that 2019 average. Um, and that was the question of why hadn't it returned to that level. But today it's now we're moving down faster than the hard data, which I think is a little bit different than the level of where it's at.
Yes. It's definitely the difference between the level and, shall we say, percent change.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
and that can also be a good indicator if we're going to see that sort of percent change on the spending side,
Hmm.
or if it will continue to be decoupled.
Well, I think that's it. Thanks so much for joining us. We have so much coming out on all of these topics as we wait and see how different things play out. We will adapt our surveys and our data, and we have a lot of trending data that will also, monthly trackers that we have set up to see how consumers react to things. And so far, we haven't seen anything besides their feeling shift in our data, but that could change any week now as things start to slow down a little bit. So we'll just have to see. Thanks, Deni.
Thank you, Sophia.
Bye.
Bye.